My scream vanished into the desert wind as Silas and Jonah took their first breath, and death reached for me at the same time. I delivered my sons beneath a sky that wanted us dead. The sun was a white blade pressed to my throat, the wind a thief that stole my breath as fast as I could drag it in. Pain tore me open once, then twice, and my voice shattered in the heat. Yet the only answer was the hiss of sand moving like a living thing around my knees. I thought the world might split and swallow me, but instead it gave me two cries, thin as threads and stubborn as fire, Silas first, Jonah next. For a heartbeat, I stopped being a body of hurt and became a witness, a mother seeing her boys before the world could change its mind. Their mouths opened like tiny red flowers, their fists clenched at life, and the sound they made cut through the wind with more courage than I felt in my entire skin. I had no midwife, no shade, no water left worth naming. I had only the jagged edge of will and the knowledge that if I paused too long, the desert would decide for us. I ripped the hem of my dress with my teeth and hands, pulling fabric into strips until my knuckles bled. I wrapped Silas and Jonah one by one, pressing their faces into the shadow of my body. Heat rolled off the ground in waves. Blood slid down my thigh and vanished into the sand as if the desert were drinking me, patient and greedy. My lungs kept begging for mercy I couldn't spare. I could not afford to shake. I could not afford to faint. If I collapsed, both my sons would follow me down. Who was I? I was Eveline Cross, a woman the world had decided was too heavy to carry. How did I come to this place? I pushed the answer aside like a thorn in the foot. Later, the memory of wheels and voices would only make me bleed faster. For now there was breath to count, skin to shield, the small animal weight of my boys to keep warm while the sun licked the moisture from their lips. "Stay with me," I whispered, though I was the one threatening to drift. My mouth was a cracked riverbed, my tongue felt like leather. I could taste metal. I could taste fear. I tucked cloth beneath Jonah's chin, slid Silas into the hollow of my arm, and bent myself into a roof. The light pressed through my hair and burned my scalp. My body shook with the aftershocks of birth, hard enough to make the babies rattle against my ribs. I bit down on a cry and let it turn into a hum so I would not frighten them. When I dared to look up, I saw the proof of what had been done to us. Two grooves ran away across the flats, wagon ruts already softening under the wind. A sentence written in leaving. I tried to follow them with my eyes until the distance blurred, until the mirage made a false lake where no water had ever lived. I listened for a voice, a name called back in regret, the clink of tack, any sign of a change of heart. Nothing answered but the rasp of sand on sand. They had decided I was a cost. They had measured me and the unborn and chosen speed over mercy. That is one way to die, by slow arithmetic. I felt the weight of it settle on my chest like a second sun. For a moment, my hands loosened. For a moment, I considered lying down and becoming part of the desert story instead of its argument. Then Silas coughed, a soft, stubborn sound, and Jonah twitched against my wrist, seeking something he trusted would be there. Life was unreasonable in them. It refused to negotiate. I gathered myself the way a woman gathers hair in a storm, quickly, without vanity, grateful for any grip. Shade, I needed it. Even a hand's width could mean the difference between breath and burial. I scanned the ground and found a shallow, darker patch where the wind had scooped a small dish out of the dune. It was not mercy, but it could pretend. I crawled, dragging my knees, holding the boys like a bundle of fire I dared not let touch the earth. Every inch scraped skin from bone. The sand burned my palms as if it had been poured from an iron pot. My body argued with me. I told it no. At the hollow, I dug with my free hand, scooping until I made a cradle deep enough to hide two tiny faces from the worst of the sky. I laid Silas and Jonah down side by side, their swaddles touching, their breaths hitching in the same rhythm, as if they had agreed before birth to keep time for me. I tucked the torn dress over them, leaving a slit where my shadow could feed them cool air. I leaned forward until my hair curtained their cheeks and the world felt smaller, kinder, almost private. "Listen," I told them, and my voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. "You are not alone." Not while I breathe. I did not say how fragile that promise was. I did not say that my milk was late, that my body was dry as the wind, that the last swallow of water had been gone since afternoon. The truth would only steal minutes, and minutes were more expensive than honesty. I chose to spend them on survival. The light shifted, sharpening, then softened just enough for me to move my weight. A thin breeze pressed against my back and cooled the sweat on my spine. It smelled of dust and old heat, not of water. I blinked until the stinging stopped and tried to measure the sky. If I could hold the boys through the worst of the sun, the night would come with its own kind of terror, but also with a chance. Cold air to lower their feverish skin, time to think, stars to navigate by if I remembered how. I told myself I would remember. I told myself I could remember anything if it meant keeping them. My mind tried to slip backward, to the morning, to the argument, to the glance that had said more than the words that followed. Not yet, I told it, not yet. The story of why I was here would not give my sons shade. The story of what I did next might. I tested my legs. They held, barely. I shifted, creating a higher roof with my shoulders, a better angle against the sun. The pain that rolled through my belly made me bite my lip until I tasted iron. I tucked the cloth tighter around tiny feet and counted to 60, then again, setting a rhythm inside my skull that kept the panic out. If I could fill an hour with numbers, I could live inside that hour. If I could live inside this hour, I could look for the next. A hawk circled far above, the only thing that moved with grace. Its shadow passed over us and my heart leapt, foolish with hope. I almost laughed at myself for wanting a bird to mean blessing. The humor broke something brittle in my chest and let a breath in I hadn't known I'd been refusing. I kissed Jonah's temple, then Silas's, the salt of my skin smearing on theirs. "You are here," I whispered, holding their names like prayer. "You are here. You are here." The desert listened. It always listens. It loves to hear promises because it knows how to break them. Still, I kept speaking, if only to keep fear from speaking louder. "We will find shade," I said. "We will find help." The words did not sound like lies in that small shelter we had made together. Time slowed. The wind rose and fell. The sky refused to move. I watched the edges of the boys' mouths for bluish hints and pressed my thumb against their feet for warmth. Silas startled and then settled with a tiny sigh. Jonah's hand opened and closed around nothing, rehearsing a future. A thought slid across my mind, cold and thin. What if no one came? What if this hollow became our world until the sand covered it and the wind erased our names? I pushed the thought away the way I had pushed away the memory of wheels. There would be time for terror later in the hours the night would give me. Now was for breath and shade and the stubborn arithmetic of staying. I set a rule. I would not look at the fading ruts again. I would not give the past the dignity of my eyes. I would look only at my sons, at the shape of their stubborn ribs rising and falling, at the pulse in their soft throats, at the way life insisted even here. If the desert wanted to make an argument, I would answer with this: two hearts refusing to be convinced. When the wind shifted once more, it brought with it a sound so thin I almost mistook it for a trick of blood in my ears, a rhythm not made by sand or hawk or the involuntary music of my tired body. I lifted my head slow as lifting a stone and listened again. There it was, a whisper of leather, the hush of a step that knew how to walk without being seen. My heart surged so hard I had to brace a hand against the ground to keep from pitching forward onto the babies. Help, I thought, and then corrected myself before hope could gallop away with sense. Not help, a presence. In the desert, presence could mean anything. It could mean salvation. It could mean a different kind of ending. I lowered myself over Silas and Jonah, covering them with my shadow until only the narrow breath slit remained, and watched the horizon with eyes that burned. The shape that formed out of light and heat was a man, far enough that he looked carved from the air, close enough that my body recognized the outline of intention. He did not hurry. He did not call. He came the way water comes in a dream, impossibly, and then all at once the only thing that matters. Fear and relief collided in my chest and left me hollow and ready. "Who are you?" I wanted to shout, but the desert would have eaten the words and given nothing back. Instead, I pressed a kiss to the cloth covering my sons and let the question settle inside me like a seed. I had asked myself how I would keep them alive. The desert had asked me when we would die. The man on the horizon, steady as a truth, was an answer to both questions, though I did not know which yet. I only knew this. I would spend whatever was left of me to find out. But the desert had another question. How could I keep them alive? The answer was about to arrive. Under the burning sky, I wrapped Silas and Jonah in torn cloth from my dress and chose to fight death. The sun did not simply shine, it judged. It pressed down on us like a sentence handed by a court I never faced, a verdict without appeal. My hands moved before my mind caught up, tearing, knotting, binding. I ripped my dress into long, uneven strips until the fabric frayed into threads that clung to my skin like cobweb. With the wider bands, I swaddled Silas, tucking him tight so his panic could press against something solid. With the thinner scraps, I made a sling for Jonah, drawing him to my chest where my heartbeat might teach us how to keep going. The cloth reeked of sweat and iron and dust, but it was all I had, and today all I had would have to mean enough. The desert kept trying to make me choose. Shade for one, shade for the other, water for one mouth, none for the second. I refused. I shifted the swaddles until my body made a small, stubborn roof over both boys at once. I folded the fabric under their heads so the sand couldn't scrape their soft skin, then anchored the ends with my own weight. A better mother would have had a needle, a proper blanket, a basin of boiled water. I had only the will to improvise. I decided that would be my skill, turning scraps into shelter, seconds into mercy. Water. I reached for the water skin out of habit and felt foolish when my fingers met nothing but dry leather. Still I tipped it, begged gravity for kindness, and coaxed 2 reluctant drops into the corner of my palm. They clung there like pearls about to fall into the sea. I touched one to Jonah's mouth, watched it vanish, then pressed the other to Silas's lips and felt it slip into his hunger before he could cry. My own throat clenched so hard I had to swallow air to trick it into loosening. Milk would not come yet. My body was a clock set wrong. I rubbed my sternum as if I could wind myself back into working order. "Soon," I whispered. "Soon, I promise." Promises are currency in a wasteland, and I spent them freely, not because I had any to spare, but because the act of speaking them made my mind stand up straight. Guilt rose like heat from the ground. If I had walked faster, argued harder, begged sooner, would the wagons have kept me? If I weren't weak, would my sons be anywhere but here? I slammed those thoughts shut with the only key I owned: resolve. There will be time to blame, I told myself. There will not be time to breathe if you waste this minute. A cry slipped across the flats. A thin, high call that could have been wind at first, then broke into the yip and cackle of coyotes testing the afternoon. Another sound answered from farther off, a note too round for hawks, too patient for vultures. The hair along my forearms prickled. Predators speak in a language older than mercy. I steadied my breathing to keep my scent from screaming panic and tucked the loose cloth tighter around my sons. Hush, I soothed, though they were already quiet, their bodies conserving what little they had. Hush, my loves. Don't tell the desert where to find you. The ground itself could kill. Sand reflected heat like a mirror turned toward the sun, cooking whatever lay against it. I shifted the boys every few breaths, rotating their contact points the way a baker turns loaves in an oven to keep them from burning. With my free hand, I scooped at the base of a nearby dune, carving a shallow trench where the layer beneath felt cooler, darker. I remembered a trick a traveler once taught me. If you dig down even a hand's breadth, the earth will keep a secret from the sky. I laid the boys into that secret and built a lip with my palm so wind would pass over instead of into it. I tore another strip from my skirt and stretched it over the trench like a sail, pinning one edge with my knee and the other with a rock. When the wind caught it, the cloth bulged, then settled, making a thin, wavering shadow. It wasn't shade so much as the idea of shade, but ideas can keep people alive when reality cannot. The smell of myself made me dizzy, salt and blood and fear steeped in heat. I pressed my wrist to my mouth and licked for moisture, then smeared what little I gathered along my lips, a child's trick that fooled no one but gave me the courage to keep lying to my body. I thought about cutting my palm to wet the boys' mouths with the truth of me, but the desert is a bad place to open new doors for infection. I chose patience instead, knowing patience in this place looked too much like surrender to be comforting. Listen to me, I told the boys, and to the hollow where I'd put them, and to the part of myself that still wanted to be rescued by the past. I can die, but not you. Do you hear me? I can be the cost. You cannot be the cost, saying it didn't make it law, but it turned my spine into something like a post I could lean against. The vow settled in my bones, heavy and cool. It gave me a direction when the horizon offered only circles. I marked the wind with spit and watched it bead toward the east. Small relief, enough to shift the trench a hand's width so the cloth above would throw a longer shadow. I tore an underskirt panel loose and twisted it into a length of rope, then tied it under Jonah's knees and over my shoulder, a second sling to distribute his weight when I moved. I wrapped Silas tighter and tucked him into the crook of my left arm, leaving my right hand free to dig, to fend, to hold whatever tool the day might offer. Survival is choreography. I practiced the steps until the dance felt like prayer. A desert fly landed on my cheek. I let it drink. I would not waste the motion swatting at something that only wanted what everything here wanted. Water, blood, an invitation to continue. The coyotes called again, closer, a sling of sound thrown over the dunes. I pictured their ribs like the rings of a barrel, counted how many voices there were, decided which way I'd face if they crested the ridge in daylight. Fear makes plans, courage acts. I told myself I had both, and that the trick was to choose the second at the right time. Heat built a wall around us and then mercifully loosened one stone. The slope to our right darkened by a shade I hadn't noticed. a thin scarf of cloud stitched across the sun. The dune's shoulder leaned into the light and gave us a strip of cool ground no wider than my forearm. Fragile hope is the only kind worth chasing here. I slid the trench 3 feet with my bare hands, cursing softly as the sand collapsed twice, then holding it firm with my knee while I moved the boys. They didn't cry. They made the smallest noises humans can make and still call them noises, and in those sounds I heard patience, and in patience I heard permission to keep trying. "Good," I said, kissing each brow, tasting dust and promise. "Good, my hearts. We will steal this day." Inch by inch I lifted the water skin again in case prayer had weight I hadn't accounted for and shook an airtight rattle. Nothing. I unscrewed the stopper anyway and breathed the ghost of old water. I pressed that damp memory to my mouth and pretended it helped. Every pretense I allowed myself freed a sliver of strength for the next true thing. The ground began to glitter with fatigue. That's what it feels like when vision starts to fray. The world turns pretty just before it turns dangerous. I refused beauty. I chose function. I tested the fabric knots with my teeth, checked fingers and toes for heat, counted breaths until numbers turned smooth inside my head. When guilt tried again, you slowed them. You deserved the leaving. I answered it with a litany of names I had not yet given my boys, names I would not surrender to the wind. "Silas Cross," I said aloud. "Jonah Cross." Speaking them made them heavier in my arms, and heavy is what you want when the world is trying to erase you. The birds found us. A shadow wheeled and lengthened, then lifted again. Vultures write their letters in the air long before they read a body, but I had no desire to be mistaken for a word they could finish. I waved once, slow and wide, letting the cloth flash a warning. Not yet. They drifted on, insulted dignitaries looking for easier bargains. The sun tilted the smallest degree. It was not mercy, but it was mathematics I could live with. The edge of the dune stretched our ribbon of shade into something that could pretend to be a room. The air cooled from iron to brass. My shoulders stopped screaming and began only to complain. I realized then that the day had not killed us, and that felt like theft so sweet I almost laughed. But the desert does not like thieves. It keeps its own ledger. I knew what the next line would say. Nightfall, cold as a blade hidden in silk, voices moving where eyes cannot see, hunger with feet, the first true trial. I bent low over my sons and breathed them in as if they were the only water on earth. "We made it through the worst light," I told them. "We will make it through the first dark." My vow did not change the sky, but it closed my hand into a fist I could use. I tightened the swaddles one more time, set my back against the dune and watched the sun begin to bleed toward the edge of the world. Somewhere beyond that rim a man was walking toward us, though I did not yet know his name. Somewhere closer the coyotes reassembled their chorus and tuned it for night. But nightfall was coming, and the desert's first true trial began. The night reminded me thirst wasn't my only enemy. Loneliness could kill me too. The sun's murder left behind a different executioner. When darkness fell, it did not come quietly. It pounced. The heat that had roasted my skin all day was torn away in an instant, leaving my body naked to a cold so sharp it felt like teeth on my bones. My sweat, still damp from the furnace of daylight, turned against me, chilling my skin until every breath rattled like broken glass inside my chest. I pressed Silas and Jonah beneath me, wrapping them in the last strips of my dress, my arms trembling as I tried to cage them in warmth my body could no longer make. Their tiny mouths rooted against my chest, searching for milk that would not come. Their small whimpers cut deeper than any knife could. And then the desert began to whisper. It was not silence. It was a language of hunger. Coyotes howled in the distance, high and shrill, the sound bouncing between dunes until it felt like a chorus circling closer. A shadow moved across the ridge above me, low to the ground, fast. My hand went to the knife at my side, the leather-wrapped handle rough against my skin. A cracked blade, barely sharp enough to cut fruit. What good would it do against fangs and claws? Yet I gripped it like a promise because it was all I had. I thought of fire. The image rose so vivid in my mind I could almost smell wood burning, hear crackling warmth, see the glow reflecting in my son's eyes. Fire would mean survival against the cold. Fire would mean hope, but fire would also be a signal, an arrow pointing down from the heavens, declaring to every predator within miles, here, fresh flesh, 2 newborns and a woman too weak to run. I could not decide which was deadlier, the cold that cut us from within or the danger that lurked in the dark. I dug into the sand instead, scooping a hollow with my bare hands, pushing Silas and Jonah into it gently, covering them with cloth so their cries would not carry. My body arched over them like a roof, my own ribs the beams holding back death. I pressed the knife point down into the earth, ready to snatch it the moment shadows turned into shapes. But it wasn't the cold or the predators that threatened to kill me first. It was the silence. It pressed against my ears, louder than screams, louder than storms. In that silence came the voice of memory, whispering, cruel, unrelenting. I saw the wagons again, their wheels cutting into the earth, pulling away from me. I saw faces turn toward the horizon rather than toward me. My husband's back, rigid, unbending as he walked with the others, leaving me to the sand. No words spoken, just absence. No hands held out, just distance. The desert had not abandoned me first. They had. Loneliness seeped in colder than the night air. It told me I was already forgotten. It told me that even if I survived until dawn, no one in the world would know my sons' names. I fought it the only way I could. I spoke aloud, my voice hoarse and ragged. Scraps of cloth, 1 knife, 1 cracked water skin, 2 sons. I made an inventory, clinging to what remained instead of what had been taken. As long as I could count, I was not gone. The coyotes hushed all at once. Silence returned, but this silence was worse because it meant they were listening. Something was moving. I froze, clutching the knife tighter, my body covering Silas and Jonah so completely that my lungs struggled to expand. A paw step crunched, close, too close. My heart thundered so hard I feared it might give me away. Jonah stirred against me, Silas whimpered. I pressed my lips to their hair, whispering, "Hush. Please hush." The step faded, the sound drifted back into the night. For now we were spared, but my fear did not leave. It burrowed deeper. Hours passed, stretched thin and cruel. The stars burned like cold fire above me, too far away to matter. I forced my eyes open every time they began to close, biting my tongue until I tasted blood, reminding myself that if I slept, the desert would win. And then, as the first light bled into the horizon, I saw it. A shadow, upright, deliberate, human, walking toward me from the edge of the world. My knife nearly slipped from my hand as my grip went weak. My heart wrenched between terror and hope. The desert had starved me of both, and now it fed me too much at once. Who was he? A rescuer? An enemy? Or the final trick of the desert before it finished us? I pulled Silas and Jonah tighter, my eyes locked on the figure growing larger with every step. At dawn, a shadow rose from the horizon. The man who would rewrite my fate. That stranger held my life in his hands like water, and I committed the crime of trusting Chaska. At dawn, I thought the desert was mocking me. Through the blur of exhaustion, a figure walked out of the rising light, tall, steady, impossible. For a heartbeat, I believed it was a ghost. a mirage shaped by my starving mind. I clutched Silas and Jonah tighter, certain my eyes had betrayed me. No one comes back in the desert. No one walks toward the dying. But he did. Each step carved through the silence like judgment. His shadow stretched across the sand, reaching me before his body did, and in that shadow I felt the weight of my own helplessness. My lips cracked open, but no sound came. The knife in my hand shook as if even steel understood its futility. And then he stopped. The man's gaze settled on me, not with cruelty, not with pity, but with a calm so foreign it almost felt violent. Without a word, he reached into his bag. My chest seized. I braced for a weapon, an end. Instead, I heard it, a slosh. Water. He lifted a leather skin into the light, tilting it so the weight inside shifted audibly. The sound alone was enough to unravel me. My throat clenched, my tongue swelled against my teeth. That noise meant salvation, or the cruelest trick the desert could play. He extended it toward me, both hands holding it steady, deliberate, as if making an offering at an altar. I did not move. What if it was poison? What if it was bait? What if this man had not come to save, but to collect what the desert had already half killed? Silas whimpered at my chest. Jonah stirred in his sling. Their lips were dry, cracked like clay in drought. They did not care if salvation came from stranger or saint. They only knew thirst. My hand trembled as I reached forward, every instinct screaming that this was surrender. My fingers brushed leather. I expected him to pull away, to laugh, to watch me beg, but he didn't. He simply let go, leaving the weight of life in my palm. The water skin was heavier than any treasure I had ever held. I raised it to my lips and tipped. The first drop cut through me like fire, warm, metallic, bitter, but alive. My throat opened like a locked door, and I swallowed until I forced myself to stop. Greed was death. I pressed a drop against Jonah's mouth, then Silas's. They latched to the moisture instantly, their tiny bodies jerking with desperate hunger for more. When I looked up, the stranger's eyes were still on me, steady, waiting. He spoke no word, and yet I heard a message. I will not harm you. But my heart refused to believe. I wanted to demand, who are you? Why are you here? Why me? But words would mean nothing. His tongue was not mine, and mine not his. So I used the only language I had left. I pressed my hand against my chest, then touched the water skin, then pressed my hand back to my chest. Thank you. He inclined his head, the smallest nod, and reached again into his bag. I stiffened, fear flooding back, but this time he withdrew a square of cloth. Coarse, clean. He did not approach me. He placed it gently on the sand between us and stepped back. His restraint was louder than words. He did not touch me. He did not crowd me. He gave space. That space told me more about him than any speech could have. Still, my fear clung. I studied his face, the lines drawn by sun and wind, the braids in his dark hair, the beads woven into his clothing. He looked carved from this land, a man who belonged here as much as the hawks and the sand itself. And me? I was an intruder, a settler, a ghost trespassing on soil that had already claimed me. Why would he save me? I had no answer. My sons stirred again, their tiny breaths hot against my skin. They needed the cloth. They needed anything that could separate their fragile bodies from the desert's hunger. My hand shook as I reached forward, picked up the fabric, and wrapped it over them. When I looked back up, his gaze had not moved. And for the first time in days, maybe longer, I felt something I had thought buried beneath betrayal and thirst. Hope. It was small, dangerous, treacherous, but it lived. And in that moment I committed my first crime against the memory of those who left me. I trusted him. Trusted the man whose name I did not yet know. Trusted Chaska. But trust isn't free, and my scars ran deeper than thirst. The tracks of those who left me behind were still carved in the sand, each one an accusation. The desert does not erase quickly. By dawn's light I could still see them. Two deep ruts carved by wagon wheels, fading but not gone, running like scars across the sand. They pointed toward a horizon I could no longer follow, but the message they carried was louder than any voice. They had left me, and the proof lay etched into the earth itself. Each track was not just a mark of wood and wheel, it was an accusation. One track whispered, "You slowed us down." Another murmured, "Your life weighed less than our survival." A third hissed, "Your sons never mattered." I pressed Silas closer to my chest, Jonah tighter into his sling. My tears came hot and silent, stinging more than the salt on my lips. I thought of their faces, their voices. I thought of the moment when I still believed they would stay. The memory opened like a wound. We had been traveling for days. The caravan stretched thin across the desert, wheels creaking, horses staggering. Water was running out. Fear was running high. And then the pain began. It gripped my stomach like a fist, sharp and unrelenting. The others turned when they heard me cry out, saw the blood soaking through my skirts, the way I bent forward with every contraction. Someone muttered, "Not now." Someone else hissed, "She'll slow us all." I remember my husband's face most of all. Daniel Cross. His eyes refused to meet mine. His jaw was clenched, his hands white on the reins of his horse. He had sworn once, before God, before men, that he would never leave me, that we were bound for better or for worse. But here in the desert, vows weighed less than water. The leader of the caravan argued for hours. "We cannot wait. The Comanche are near. The sun will kill us if we lose the pace. One woman and her unborns cannot be the price." One woman. That was what I had become. Not a wife, not a mother, not Eveline, just a cost. Some voices argued back. A gray-haired woman with a rosary in her hands whispered, "We cannot leave her. No child should be born into sand and silence," but her words broke like waves against rock. The men shook their heads. Fear spoke louder than compassion. Daniel said nothing. His silence was worse than a knife. When the wagons creaked forward again, I stumbled after them, clutching my belly, screaming his name. "Daniel, Daniel, please." He never turned. The wheels rolled, the horses strained, the voices faded. Dust rose into the air, choking my cries until they became nothing. And then I was alone. Alone with pain. Alone with death already licking at my heels. That was the day my faith broke. Not faith in God. Not faith in survival, faith in people. I came back to myself in the present, my eyes fixed on those fading tracks. My chest heaved as if every line in the sand carved itself deeper into me. Was it my weakness that doomed me, or their cruelty? The question haunted me. The desert never gave answers. But when I turned my head, I saw Chaska sitting a little distance away, his back straight, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert and patient. He had not spoken a word since giving me water. He had not demanded anything. He had simply stayed. And in that silence, I felt a weight shift. The people who looked like me had abandoned me. The man who looked nothing like me had chosen without question to remain. I stared down at Silas and Jonah, their tiny fists curled against the cloth he had given us, their lips damp with the water he had spared. The sand carried two kinds of tracks now. One set leading away, cutting me open with every glance, and another, a single trail of footprints, leading toward me, toward life, toward the possibility of something I had thought lost forever. Compassion. I touched the knife still at my belt, remembering how I had gripped it through the night, ready to fight off coyotes, ready to fight off men. But for the first time since being left, I wondered if I didn't have to fight at all. I did not know Chask. I did not know his heart, his intentions, but I knew this. When my own people condemned me, he had offered life, and that was enough for now. His answer wasn't words. It was teaching me how to endure. Chaska read the desert like a map and showed me survival was knowledge and skill combined. He did not save me with speeches, he saved me with ways of seeing. That morning after the water and the cloth, Chaska pointed not at me, not at the sky, but at the ground itself, as if the earth were a page and we had only to learn its letters. He knelt and pinched a small drift of sand, let it fall from his fingers. The grains trailed east, thin as smoke. He tapped his chest, then drew a line with his hand along the crest of a dune, showing where it curled and broke. I watched the arc, the way one side was smooth and the other side steep, as if the hill had a secret face. He touched the steep side and made a cutting motion. Windward, leeward, the desert's handwriting. I repeated his gestures so I wouldn't forget. He nodded once, satisfied, then traced a shallow pattern with a stick, a dune, a valley, a little swirl that meant the wind would pool there, cooler, safer for the babies. He pointed to my sons, to the swirl, to the shade we could steal if we were clever. His eyes asked a question I understood. Can you walk? I could and I couldn't. My legs were the memory of legs. But I gathered Silas and Jonah, adjusted the slings, bound my torn dress tighter with a strip he tore from his own shirt, and followed. We moved in the negative spaces on the edges the wind forgot. Chaska did not hurry me. He set a pace I could bear, a pace that kept breath inside my chest instead of flinging it out onto the sand. When we climbed, he placed his feet where the dune held firm, not where it slid. When we descended, he took the curve that would let gravity do the work. More than once I thought I would fold and be done, but every time he paused, lifted 2 fingers and closed them gently, as if collecting my scattered courage and handing it back to me. When the sun grew mean again, he taught me water the way a midwife teaches breath, slowly, rhythmically, in sips that do no harm. He knelt beside a scrub of green I would have stomped past and spread his palm as if listening. At the base of the plant, the sand was darker by a shade you would miss if you were busy dying. He smiled with his eyes and pressed his ear to the earth. I copied him and heard, was it real? A stillness that did not belong to emptiness. He dug with the flat of his hand, not deep, just enough to bruise the crust, and the sand turned cool, then damp. He set a shard of broken gourd into the hollow and waited. The desert bled into it, drop by careful drop. I cried a little then, not from pain, from proof. He showed me other signs, a band of swallows cutting low across the heat, water somewhere ahead, a line of antelope tracks that widened and softened where they paused to drink. Cottonwoods on the horizon, their leaves flashing like coins, trees that keep their feet in secrets the sky cannot dry. I watched, learned, failed, learned again. When I guessed wrong, he did not correct me with the sound. He drew it in the sand, wiped it away, drew it again until my hands copied the shape without thinking. He taught me the wind while teaching me my body. In a fold between dunes, he built a shelter no higher than my shoulder. 2 sticks netted with scrub and a mantle of cut brush, and showed me how to angle it so the wind would cool without stealing warmth from the babies. He heated stones in a pocket fire, no smoke, only the faintest glow, fueled with dung so old it turned to ember without betraying us, and wrapped those stones in his cloth. He gestured to my lower belly, to the ache that made my vision dapple. He placed the warm bundle there and pressed his palm over my hand. The heat seeped into the torn places and quieted them until I could stand straight without seeing stars. He brewed a tea in a blackened tin, leaves I did not know steeped with a pinch of something bitter. He drank first, a swallow, then waited, watching my face as if it were the sky. When the world did not tilt, he placed the tin in my hands. Willow, I thought from the taste, and something like sage. The pain in my spine untied a knot and sighed. He spoke in gestures and small acts, and they added up to dignity. When I nursed, he turned his back and moved a few paces off, eyes on the horizon, posture like a guard posted at the edge of a camp that did not yet exist. When he offered me food, he tasted it first, then set it where I could reach, then stepped away, never reaching toward my sons without opening his hands first like a question. When night whispered, he laid his bed downwind, close enough for his hearing to reach us, far enough that my fear did not have to share space with gratitude. Food was not a feast, it was a plan. He coaxed a rabbit from brush with a snare he braided in minutes from yucca fibers and thread he pulled from his own shirt. He showed me the knot twice, then put the snare in my hands and let me fail until the loop held true. When the rabbit came, he thanked it with a touch, quick and private. He cooked in a shallow pit so the light would not betray us, boiled the bones until the broth went cloudy with nourishment, and poured it into a gourd he had carved until it fit my hand like it had always belonged there. He cooled a fingertip of broth and touched it to Silas's lips, then Jonah's, proof against the desert that we remembered sweetness. He found roots where my eyes saw only consequence. A pale tuber that gave up starch, a bitter stem that scraped and rinsed turned helpful. He showed me berries I must not touch and a cactus I could, how to slice the pad and scrape the spines with a flat stone until the green was safe, then sear it on the coals to make a wetness the mouth could bless. He cracked seeds between stones and sifted the chaff with his fingers, made a paste with a little fat, a little grit, everything honest. Hunger does not demand flavor, it demands truth. In the cool of evening, he taught me the sky with a stick in the sand, where the evening star lives, how it keeps its promise if you learn what promise it made, how the two-hand measure from horizon to star gives you time, how to read the darkness for weather by the way the air smells of far dust or near rain. He dragged a line, then another crossing it and nodded at me. I put my hand there and felt for the first time since the wagons left something like the beginning of knowing. Through it all, he watched the babies with the expression of a man reading a fire, alert, careful, never careless. Once, when Jonah's breath hitched, he reached his hands out, stopped, looked to me. I lifted Jonah to him and felt the oldest trust in the world pass between us. The trust of lives exchanged hand to hand. He set his ear to Jonah's chest, listened, then nodded and placed him back. He cut a strip of soft hide and showed me how to bind it beneath their chins when the wind wanted to steal their heat, how to loosen it when they needed to feast on air. I found my feet in those lessons. I stood longer, I walked steadier. The ache in my hips became a memory I could carry rather than a wound I had to drag. Milk found me again, timid, then certain, called by the small mouths that believed in me even when I did not. When it came, I cried and laughed in the same breath, a trick the desert had taught me without knowing. There were moments when the past lunged, Daniel's back turning, the wagons rolling, the prayer I had made that someone would prove me worth the cost. Every time the memory rose, Chaska happened to glance my way as if he heard things I did not say. He would point then to something practical. The darker fringe beneath a plant, the faint flight of birds, low and quick, the drift line where a wind had slept yesterday and would likely sleep again tonight. He did not argue with my ghosts. He handed me a task that burned them out of my hands. Once, when the babies slept and the light went kind, he made a cradle board from a plank of driftwood bleached and shaped by the world before us. He padded it with grass he had softened in water and wrapped its edges in the same cloth he had given me at dawn. He did not tie my sons to it. He showed me how to do the knot, how to leave space for their bellies, how to set the angle so breath moved easy. He rested the board against a dune and tapped the tip twice. Strong. Safe. I kissed his knuckles before I knew I would and felt heat rise to my face. He dipped his head without looking at me, then rose to check the horizon, the ghost of a smile in the set of his shoulders. I began to measure the day not in fear but in lessons. The way shadow lengthens, the way heat lifts off the ground like a living thing, the way quiet can mean rest and can also mean teeth. I learned to wet the inside of the water skin with a breath before pouring, to turn my back to the wind so my sons could nurse in peace, to braid fibers into cords strong enough to carry what little we had left. It was not heroism. It was competence. And competence in a place like this is the purest mercy. By the third dusk, I could say to myself without lying, I will not die today. The thought did not tempt the desert. It steadied my hand when I cut roots, steadied my breath when I climbed. It let me look at the sky and think of tomorrow not as a threat but as a debt I might be able to pay. That night, as we settled behind a dune shaped like a sleeping animal, the air changed. Chaska tasted it literally, tongue to teeth, eyes narrowing. He scooped a pinch of sand and let it fall. It did not drift east in a thin veil. It leapt up and stung his knuckles as if the ground had grown claws. He looked at me, then at the babies, then back to the ridge we had chosen for shelter. His hands spoke fast, flat palms pushing down, then circling tight. Stay low. Tie everything. Make small what the wind can find. Far out the horizon went the color of iron. The line where sky met earth blurred, then thickened, then began a move as if a wall had decided it wanted to walk. I felt the first grains hit my cheek, sharp as needles. The dune growled. Chaska's calm did not waver, but his pace doubled without ever becoming panic. He anchored the shelter, tightened the sling across my shoulders, pressed a wet cloth to each baby's nose and mouth, then to mine. He pulled his scarf across his own face and lifted his brows in a question that was not a question at all. Ready? I set my hand on the cradle board, felt its strength, felt mine, and nodded. The desert had one last fury to unveil, and we were no longer strangers to its language. But the desert had one last fury to unleash, a storm, Chaska told me with a gesture. Just a few more steps and my story would no longer be alone. After the storm, the desert smelled different. The air no longer stung, it sagged heavy with dust, every breath a chalky weight in my lungs. The sky had softened to a pale bruise, the sun a blurred coin pressing weakly through the haze. The silence was almost unbearable. I had grown so used to the roar of the storm that the quiet now felt like another trick, as if the earth was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would collapse. I almost did, but Chaska touched my shoulder, his hand firm and steady, and pointed ahead. Beyond the wreckage of dunes, through the dust-thick air, I saw it, a curl of smoke. At first, I thought my mind was lying again. I had imagined water, imagined faces, imagined mercy too many times to trust my own eyes. But then I smelled it, wood smoke, real and sharp, and beneath it faint but undeniable something else. Cooking, meat, food. My knees buckled. Not from fear this time, but from relief so sudden it felt like weakness. Chaska caught me before I fell, his hand slipping under my elbow, steadying me. He pointed again, then pressed his palm flat over his chest, then toward the horizon. Home. I swallowed the sob that rose in my throat. Home. What a dangerous word. We walked. Slowly, painfully, but with direction. My legs dragged, my body still raw from the storm. But each step drew us closer to that ribbon of smoke. Silas whimpered against my chest. Jonah stirred in his sling. They smelled it too, I thought. Hope. When the camp came into view, I nearly stopped breathing. Tents rising like small mountains against the sand. Horses tethered near the edge. The distant sound of children's laughter, voices mingling. A rhythm of life so different from the silence I had been drowning in. It felt like stepping into another world, a world I did not belong to. My instinct was to turn back, to run. But where? Back into the desert, back to death? Number. My only road led forward. Chaska raised his hand as we approached. Two figures appeared from the camp's edge. Men with bows slung across their shoulders, their eyes sharp, their steps cautious. They did not charge us, but they did not welcome us either. Their language broke through the quiet, quick words tossed to Chaska, their eyes flicking to me, to the bundle at my chest. I tightened my arms around Silas and Jonah. I could not understand their words, but I knew suspicion when I saw it. Chaska gestured to me, his movements calm, deliberate. He tapped his chest, then gestured back toward the desert. He spoke their tongue, low and firm. I caught only one word, repeated twice. His name, Chaska. They lowered their bows slightly, though their eyes stayed hard. One called back into the camp. Moments later, a woman came, older with hair streaked silver, her posture upright, her face both stern and soft. She carried herself with the authority of one who had seen much and endured more. She approached, her gaze never leaving me. When she stopped, only a breath away, she looked down at my sons. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched, a thread that could snap in any direction. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Then, gently, unexpectedly, she reached out her hand, hovering just above Silas's face, waiting. She did not touch until I nodded. Her fingers brushed his cheek, then Jonah's, her expression unreadable. She looked back at Chaska, said something I could not decipher, then gestured sharply toward the camp. And just like that, the decision was made. We were allowed in. I stumbled forward, every nerve on fire. Children darted past, their eyes wide with curiosity. Women paused at their work, their gazes wary. Men watched from the edge, silent, measuring me. I felt their judgment like arrows piercing my skin. But I also felt something else. Life. Real, tangible life. The smell of cooking fires, the murmur of voices, the warmth of a community that existed beyond survival. For the first time since my sons had been born, I believed they might live to see another day. The silver-haired woman led me to a tent. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs, smoke, and leather. She gestured for me to sit. I lowered myself carefully, clutching Silas and Jonah. She knelt before me, her hands moving quickly, professionally. She pressed her palm to my forehead, checked my pulse at my wrist, touched my belly with the kind of practiced care that spoke of experience. A midwife. My throat tightened with sudden gratitude. She said words I didn't know, but her tone was kind, and when she poured warm water into a small wooden bowl and gestured for me to drink, I obeyed without hesitation. It tasted of smoke and clay, but it soothed my throat. She dabbed herbs on my torn skin, wrapped my arms in strips of cloth cleaner than anything I had seen in weeks. My body, raw and trembling, began to ease under her touch. When the twins cried, she reached for them but stopped, her hands open in question. I hesitated, then handed Jonah to her. She cradled him with a tenderness that made my chest ache, rocking him gently, humming a melody low and steady. His cries softened. For a moment, the sight nearly undid me. Here, in a place I did not belong, my sons were being cared for, protected. I looked at Chaska. He stood at the tent's entrance, his back straight, his eyes never leaving me. He had not forced me here. He had not demanded thanks. He had only led and waited and trusted that I would follow. And now I had. I pressed my face into my hands and let the tears come hot and unrelenting. For the first time, they were not tears of fear. They were tears of relief. My story, once carved in sand and silence, was no longer mine alone. But among them, suspicion had its own voice. Chaska told me with a gesture just a few more steps and my story would no longer be alone. After the storm, the world felt hollowed out, as if the wind had chewed it to the bone and left only silence behind. Dust lay on my tongue like ash. The sun was a dull coin pressed behind a veil. I could hear my own breath again, ragged, mortal, stubborn. When I tried to stand, my knees gave. Chaska caught my elbow, steady as a post sunk deep into earth, and pointed ahead. A thin column of smoke stitched the sky to the horizon. At first I did not trust it. The desert had offered me mirages before, lakes that dissolved, shadows that became wolves, hope that cut like glass. But then the air shifted and I smelled wood, not sand, meat, not dust. My mouth flooded with a memory of flavor. Silas whimpered against my chest. Jonah twitched in his sling and pressed his face into the cloth, searching for whatever the air promised. Chaska tapped his chest once, then spread his hand toward the smoke. The gesture was simple and enormous. Come. I went because there was nowhere else left to go. Every step tugged at new pain. I was a patchwork of cuts and aches, of places the sand had taken skin and places the wind had hammered bone, but the smoke stitched me forward. With each rise we climbed, the world filled with sound. First a murmur, then strands of laughter, then the careful rhythm of work. Life real and near. The camp rose out of the dunes like an answer. Lodges standing in a crescent, their hides dark with weather. Horses flicking tails in the lee of a windbreak. Racks for drying meat, the shape of order where the desert had offered only chance. Figures moved at the edge. 2 men with bows, their steps light, their eyes bright as flint. They saw us and came on quick but not reckless. Their gazes slid to my sons, then to my knife, then to Chaska. Words passed between the men and him in a cadence I could not enter. One of them lifted his chin toward me, measuring. I lowered my eyes and drew the babies closer without hiding them. I wanted them to see I carried lives, not trouble. I wanted them to see I had nothing left to take. Chaska's voice stayed low even. He pointed to the horizon, traced the shape of a storm with his hand, then touched his chest and mine. He spoke his name. I recognized it now when others said it. Chaska. He gestured to my sons and paused, palms up, the simplest plea in the world. The men's stances loosened by a hair. One cupped his hands around his mouth and called toward the lodges. What answered was a woman. She moved like a tree that had outlived many winds, upright, deeply rooted, scarred in ways that only made her stronger. Silver streaked her braids. A small pouch of herbs hung at her waist. She did not look at Chaska first. She looked at me. Then she looked at Silas and Jonah and did not look away. She came close enough that I could see the map of lines at the corners of her eyes. Her hands lifted, then halted in air, waiting. I did not know her words, but I knew that question. I opened the blanket. She touched Jonah's cheek with 2 fingers, then Silas's, then my wrist where the pulse thudded like a drum out of rhythm. Her mouth softened. Her brow did not. She spoke to Chaska, short and sure. He answered, and in the space between their voices a decision happened. The woman turned and beckoned me into the camp. I crossed the threshold between sand and order and felt the weight of being seen. Men paused over sinew and wood. Women straightened from their work with hides. Children froze mid-game. their eyes wide at the stranger with two tiny faces tucked against her. No one rushed me. No one smiled. They watched the way a river watches a branch floating in. Will it pass? Will it snag? Will it drown? The woman led me toward a lodge set a little apart. Inside was shadow, relief, the smell of smoke braided with crushed leaves. My eyes watered from the sudden kindness of it. She gestured to a buffalo robe laid near the hearth. I sank to it and trembled with the effort, the babies crying at the change in air. She knelt without fuss and went to work. Warm water sloshed into a wooden bowl. She dipped a cloth, wrung it with strong hands, and cleaned the grit from my face, from my cracked lips, from the tender places where the storm had tried to erase me. When she reached for Silas, she paused again, asking. I handed him to her. He fit in her arms as if she had held 1,000 babies and remembered each weight. Her fingers moved with the intelligence of long practice, 2 at the chest, noting breath, 2 at the neck, counting the small wild beat, a palm at the belly, soothing circles. She murmured sounds I didn't know but recognized in my bones. There, there, little one. Breathe. Jonah's turn, the same measured care. She dabbed a paste that smelled of willow and sage along the raw edges of my skin. The sting climbed and then receded under a bigger warmth. She fed me without asking permission, not because she assumed, but because she refused to let pride starve me. A wooden spoon, a sip of broth fat with the memory of bone, a strip of meat soft as a promise. She watched me chew like a hawk watches wind, not predatory but alert to the way bodies speak. When I coughed, she waited. When I nodded, she gave another spoon. I learned the rhythm and took it like instruction. Swallow, breathe, swallow. Milk found me again while we were there. It came shyly at first, a tingle that I almost mistook for more pain. Then an ache, then a flood called forward by 2 mouths that never stopped believing in me. I cried when it came, and it felt like weakness until the woman squeezed my shoulder once, brief and firm, and the shame fell away. I set Jonah to nurse while Silas slept, then swapped. The lodge went quiet the way the earth goes quiet after rain. Chaska stood at the doorway, back to the hide, eyes on the camp. He did not speak across the room to fill space that did not belong to him. When our eyes met, I felt the strangeness of safety, the knowledge that if I slept, he would keep his watch, that if I woke, he would still be there. I smiled without meaning to. The expression startled my own face. He answered with the smallest curve at the corner of his mouth, a movement no one else would have noticed. The woman, midwife, healer, elder, all at once, bound my wrists where the storm had cut them, wrapped my ribs where the wind had bruised them, and lifted my chin to look into my eyes the way people do when they want to know if the person they are saving has decided to live. I nodded. She did not smile. She touched the pouch at her waist, pulled out a pinch of something sharp-scented, tossed it on the coals. The smoke rose sweet and bitter. She closed her eyes and breathed it, then opened them and set a hand flat over my heart. Not hard, not soft. I put my hand over hers. The permission moved both ways. Outside, camp life flowed around the lodge like a river around a stone. Children's voices rose and fell. Someone sang a work song with a beat my foot wanted to follow. A horse snorted. A dog barked once and was told hush. This was a world with rules that were not mine and a grace I did not deserve. The sound of it filled the empty places the storm had carved. When the babies slept, the woman loosened my hair and combed wind and grit from it with patient strokes, the way mothers do when the story has been too long and the body needs reminding that softness exists. I wanted to apologize for the smell of me, for the dirt ground into everything I wore. for the way my fear made my shoulders crowd my ears. She never asked for apology. She asked for water and handed it to me. She asked for quiet and the room obeyed. Not everyone outside obeyed their softer instincts. Under the voices, I began to hear the low hum of conversation that belongs to caution. A man's tone clipped, a woman's answer wary. The word for stranger. I did not know it, but I knew the sound. Scarcity is a hungry teacher. It makes people count what they have and fear what they might lose. I wrapped my fingers around the babies and understood. Refuge is never free. Chaska stepped half in, half out, and spoke with a younger man whose face was drawn tight with questions. I watched their hands move. Chaska's open, steady. The other's sharp, fast. Chaska finished with a gesture I had come to know, palm down, slow. The young man's shoulders eased a little, not enough to call it trust, enough to call it postponement. The woman brought me a shallow bowl and a soft cloth and set them near my feet. She lifted her brows at me. "You can?" I nodded. She left the lodge, granting me privacy as if it were a thing I was owed. I washed the dust from my son's eyelids, from their fists, from the tender fold behind each ear. I whispered their names while I worked, each syllable a nail I hammered into the world. Silas Cross, Jonah Cross. I said my own name last, testing if it still fit. Eveline. The air did not reject it. By the time dusk slid over the camp, the lodge walls had taken on the color of embers. The healer returned and tucked extra skins around us. Chaska ducked inside to set a small bundle at my side. A strip of dried meat, a spoon, a sliver of something that tasted like wild mint when I pressed it to my tongue. He did not linger. He looked to the woman first, received a nod, and then to me. His eyes asked a question without words. "Are you safe?" I answered with the same language, my hand rising an inch, palm outward. "Yes." My body began to soften into the ground. The babies rustled and sank, their mouths opening in sleep like flowers closing at night. I felt a tremor of panic at the thought that peace could turn its back as quickly as it had turned toward me. But the lodge was warm, my skin was clean, and my son's breaths feathered my collarbone. For the first time since the wagons rolled away, I was not preparing to die. I did not mistake mercy for belonging. Outside voices braided with something harder. Questions that would need answers, resources that would need guarding. I was a woman from the people who had taken and crossed and claimed. I was a stranger with two hungry mouths. I had arrived on the far side of a storm, asking to be trusted by those who owed me nothing. I placed my palm over each small chest and felt the thud that made everything else worth arguing for. The healer watched my hands and gave a single, almost invisible nod, as if she had measured me and found a number she could work with. My story had found a circle of warmth, but circles have edges and edges have teeth. But among them, suspicion had its own voice. Dust rose in the distance, either help was coming or betrayal was returning. The ground shuddered before I saw it. At first I thought it was only my pulse, too fast, too frantic. But then the camp dogs lifted their noses and snarled at the horizon. Children's laughter snapped in half. A clean silence cut through the lodges, through the smoke, through my bones. I turned with Silas against my chest and Jonah in the sling, and there it was. A wall of dust, moving with intention, not wind. Beneath it, faint at first and growing, came the rhythm of hooves, a drumline my body remembered even if my mind wished to forget. A scout tore across the flats, his pony foamed white, his voice slicing the air. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood urgency. Men rose without shouting, hands going to bows, to lances, to knives. Women gathered children the way a wave gathers shells. The healer, silver hair, steady eyes, stepped to my side as if she had always been there. She didn't touch me. She didn't need to. Her presence said, "Stand, breathe, look." Chaska emerged from shadow like a decision. He faced the dust as if reading a sentence only he could see, then glanced back at me. He tapped his chest once, "I am here," and opened his palm to me. "You choose." The gesture landed like a weight and like a mercy. I could feel two paths unspool under my feet. If the riders were mine, if they were the caravan, then I could return to the world that had named me wife and then subtracted me like a miscounted load. Or I could stay in this circle that had given me water, heat, instruction, and distance enough to grieve without drowning. Both roads carried a price my sons would pay. Dust climbed the sky like smoke from a burning god. The horses drew nearer. The air changed. It tasted of iron and memory. Silas whimpered. Jonah burrowed, his fists opening and closing as if squeezing courage from the cloth. The healer leaned nearer and murmured something that lived between prayer and order. Her hand hovered an inch from my elbow, not claiming, not leaving. "If it is them," I whispered, "what do I owe the past?" Chaska didn't answer. He never answered questions that only I could live with. He pointed once to the babies, then to my heart, then back to the horizon, and waited. The riders resolved into shapes, a handful at first, then more, the front rank black against the glare. I knew those silhouettes. I had watched them shrink when I bled in the sand, had counted their dwindling outlines until hope cracked like a dry gourd. Now they grew, and each stride beat a bruise into the tender place I'd tried to protect. I tasted the old dust of their departure in my mouth and swallowed hard against it. Around me the Sioux did not posture. They arranged. They braided readiness into the air. Young men flowed to the edges of camp like water seeking low ground. Elders took positions with the patience of stones. The healer shifted a step to block wind from the babies' faces. A boy no older than 13 offered me his canteen without looking directly at me, as if courtesy were a game he'd learned by heart. I drank and felt the water find my voice again. "Chaska," I said, "if they beg me to return." He shook his head once. "Not no, not yes. You decide. Would you escort me?" His eyes held mine for one heartbeat, two. He touched 2 fingers to his own chest, then to the earth between us, then lifted his hand, palm flat, and tipped it like a scale. The answer was not ownership. It was vow. "I will stand with your choice, whatever its cost." The dust thinned enough to show faces. My breath stuttered. Daniel rode at the front, shoulders squared, jaw set in the old stubborn line I had loved once for its certainty. Behind him, the leader with the ledger eyes. 2 brothers who laughed hard when whiskey made it easy. The gray-haired woman who had argued for me with a prayer clenched in her fist. No one looked the same, but the shape of them, the math of them was familiar. They had survived. Without me, without us. They reined in at a distance that meant respect and fear and calculation. The horses blew and stomped, flinging dust. The men's eyes raked the camp, lodges, horses, guards, exits, counting risk. Then Daniel saw me. His head jerked as if struck from behind. He dismounted so quickly he stumbled and caught himself. He said my name. The sound traveled the strip of dead air between us and struck me like an old key hammered into a new lock. "Eveline." My knees nearly unstrung. My name in his mouth had once meant shelter. Now it sounded like a debt called due. He took a step and 3 Sioux archers lifted bows in the same breath. Daniel froze, palms rising, a clumsy show of peace. His eyes jumped to the babies, and whatever color the desert had left in him drained away. "Twins," he said, and the word frayed. Anger, old and quick, flared in me. Now he could see. Now he could count to 2. I tightened my hold and felt the tiny push of Silas's heel against my ribs, a reminder that rage cannot warm a child. The caravan leader urged his horse forward half a length. "We lost water," he called, careful voice, careful posture. "We were pressed." The Comanche, he left the rest hanging like a snare. He gestured vaguely as if the sky itself had made their choice. "We came looking when we could." A sound scraped out of me that might have been a laugh if it hadn't broken on the way up. The healer's hand drifted closer to my arm. Chaska didn't move. He was wind-stilled into body, witness, and wall. Daniel took another step and risked a glance at the archers before speaking. "I should have stayed," he said lower now. "For me, not for the camp. I should have—" The words collapsed under the weight of everything they could not carry. "I couldn't lose the wagon. I thought you would slow, then we'd circle back. Eveline, I thought." "You thought wrong," I said. "The desert had taught me how to spend words without begging them to come back." He swallowed. His gaze flicked to Chaska, to the healer, to the ring of people who had not moved, but had somehow closed ranks without stepping. "Come with us," he said. "Please. We can make Fort Laramie in 2 weeks with the pace we have. There will be a doctor, a roof, a bed. You don't belong here." The last sentence sliced clean. I looked at the camp. That had wrapped me in knowledge and cloth. At the smoke that smelled like supper and medicine. At the boy with the canteen pretending he didn't watch me. I looked at Chaska, whose language had kept me alive when mine had failed, whose distance had been the exact length of respect. I looked at my sons whose breaths had evened in this circle, whose names were anchors I had finally driven into the world. "I don't belong anywhere that measures me as weight," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. The leader shifted in his saddle, impatience tightening his jaw. "We don't have time to argue. If you're coming, come. If not—" He glanced toward the far ridges, reading risks that had nothing to do with my heart. "We won't camp close." Daniel flinched at the hardness, then tried again with softness he borrowed from memory. "Eveline, we were afraid. I was afraid. I can carry the boys, I can—" He reached a hand out that had once fit the small of my back like a promise. Silas stirred. Jonah coughed. The sound was thin and raw and true. I felt their ribs and knew what night could do to breath when it decided to be cruel. The Sioux had herbs and broths and a woman who could read fever with her palm. The caravan had distance and apology and the same arithmetic that had left me with the sand. I lifted my eyes to Chaska. He didn't nod. He didn't plead. He did what he always did. He waited for the thing only I could speak. "I will not walk back into the hands that dropped me," I said. "If there is a roof, it is this sky. If there is a doctor, she is here." I turned slightly, enough to bring the healer into my words. Her mouth didn't show pride, but her eyes stopped searching me for permission. They had it. Daniel's face folded. He looked 20 years older in a breath. "You would choose them over your people?" I felt the question land in my chest and find no purchase. "My people are the ones who hold me when I bleed," I said. "My people are the ones who gave my children back their breath." Silence spread again, different now, full, shaped. Behind Daniel, the gray-haired woman who had once argued for me touched her rosary and bowed her head. When she looked up, her eyes found mine and asked a smaller, kinder question. "Are you safe?" I answered with a nod I hadn't known I was saving for her. She smiled, brief, like a candle lit against wind. The leader exhaled, an impatient sound that made his horse toss its head. "We move," he said to his men. "Now." He glanced at Daniel. "Leave her if she's chosen." Daniel stood there with his hand hanging ridiculous in the air, then let it fall. For a moment I thought he would say something that would change the stubborn earth under our feet. He didn't. He said my name again, softer than before, as if speaking to a door he knew he no longer owned. Eveline. I answered him with silence, not as punishment, but as closing. He mounted. The caravan wheeled, dust rising to swallow them the way dust had spit them out. Before the wall took him, Daniel turned once more. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't bow his head. He only looked, and in that look I saw the sum of our ledger. What we had been, what we were not. The dust climbed, the ground stilled, the camp exhaled in a long, careful breath. I did not realize I was shaking until Chaska's shadow fell over my feet like shade and the healer's palm warmed the ridge of my spine. I looked down at my sons. They looked back with the absolute trust of creatures who know nothing but the present. I kissed their hair and felt the decision settle into my bones the way heat settles into stone at dusk. Deep, inevitable mine. The truth became clear the moment I looked into their faces. I saw my betrayal carved into their eyes. The very ones who left me now begged for my choice. Their faces told the story before their mouths did. Daniel's eyes were the worst. Eyes that had once promised me forever now carried a hunger I could not name. Guilt, hope, desperation. Perhaps all three muddled together until even he couldn't separate them. Behind him, the leader of the caravan kept his chin stiff, his expression locked tight as though the desert itself had carved his jaw into stone. A few women shifted nervously in their saddles, their gazes flicking between me and the camp, shame painting their cheeks even before words were spoken. The silence thickened. Then Daniel stepped forward. "Eveline," he said, voice straining as if my name was a wound reopening. "We thought you were gone." His hand twitched upward as if to reach for me, but fell back useless at his side. The words landed like stones in water, ripples but no weight. "Gone," I repeated, my voice flat, steady. "You didn't think." "You decided." He flinched but pressed on. "We were dying. We had no choice. If we stopped." His eyes darted to the leader, searching for confirmation. The caravan leader leaned forward on his saddle. His voice carried the same authority that had silenced my cries in the desert. It was survival. The tribe. Your labor. It was too much risk. We could not wait. The air in my lungs burned. You could not wait for me to give birth. You could not wait for your own blood to breathe. My voice cracked, sharp and raw. And yet here I stand, with two sons who lived despite you. A murmur rippled through the riders. The gray-haired woman with the rosary bowed her head. One of the younger men shifted uneasily in his seat, muttering something I could not catch. Shame was a living thing crawling over their faces like ants on sugar. Daniel's hands opened, trembling. "Eveline, I should have stayed. I wanted to. But the vote, the danger." His throat worked as if words were thorns lodged there. "I told myself we'd circle back. That we'd find you, I prayed." "Prayers do not bind wounds," I cut in. "Prayers do not shade newborns from the sun. Prayers do not pour water into a dying woman's mouth." He did. I turned, my hand gesturing toward Chaska, who stood silent at my side. His shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the caravan. He had not spoken once during the exchange, and yet his presence said more than any of their words. Daniel's eyes flicked to Chaska, and I saw something in his expression curdle. Not just guilt now, jealousy, resentment, the thought that another man had stood where he should have. A split opened within the caravan. A woman I barely knew whispered, "She's right," and lowered her head. Another muttered angrily, "We had no choice," her voice sharp as a whip. The gray-haired woman with the rosary raised her eyes to mine, wet and glistening, and whispered, "I begged them not to." The division spread like fire through dry grass. Some turned their faces away from me, unwilling to meet my eyes. Others looked straight at me, their shame naked. A few clung to defiance, their glares as sharp as the desert sun. I felt Jonah stir against me, his small breath warming my chest. Silas whimpered softly, a reminder of how fragile life still was in my arms. Their sounds silenced every other thought inside me until only one truth remained. They were not weights to be abandoned. They were the measure of everything worth enduring. My voice rose, not shouting, but carrying, heavy with the weight of what I had lived. Do you know what it is to scream into the desert wind while blood pours from you and the only answer is silence? Do you know what it is to hold two children against your chest and wonder if your breath will outlast theirs? Do you know what it is to beg the sky for mercy and find none, until a stranger, a man you would call your enemy, offers water from his own lips? I pointed toward the sand at my feet where the storm had scoured but not erased. Every grain here remembers your choice. And my sons remember too, because they would not be alive if not for the very man you fear. The caravan leader stiffened. You would stay among them. Eveline, think of what you are doing. Think of who you are. I am thinking, I said, fire filling my chest. I am thinking of my sons, who will grow in a place where they are not measured against the worth of a wagon wheel. I am thinking of a people who did not ask me to beg, who did not look at me and see only a burden. I am thinking of the man who saw me broken and bled and stayed when my own turned away. Daniel's face crumpled. You would choose them over me? It was almost a plea. Almost. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the man who had once sworn vows, the man I had once trusted with my life. But vows had crumbled in the desert like bones under the sun. The truth was carved into the tracks he had left behind. My sons are not bargaining chips. They are not burdens. They are not weights to be dropped when convenient. My voice shook with anger and love all at once. I will stay where my sons are valued, and that is not with you. A silence heavier than thunder followed. The split in the caravan widened. Some turned their heads ashamed. Others glared, but no one spoke. The truth had settled like stone, immovable, undeniable. Daniel's lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. His hands opened empty. Finally, he turned his face away as if the sun itself had become too harsh. I shifted Jonah in my arms, kissed Silas's head, and stepped back toward Chaska. His presence at my side was a shield, not because he spoke for me, but because he did not need to. The caravan lingered restless, dust swirling around their horses' hooves. The leader muttered something to his men. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to turn. Daniel was the last to move, his eyes clinging to mine, begging for something I could no longer give. As they rode away, the desert seemed to exhale. The dust they left behind curled into the sky like smoke from a fire finally dying. I held my sons tighter and whispered into their hair, "You will never be abandoned again." And then came the moment that gave my story its ending. The dust the caravan kicked up had not yet fallen when the world seemed to go weightless, as if the moment I had named an ending were only the breath before a beginning. I kept my eyes away from the ridge where they'd vanished and steadied my hands around Silas and Jonah. The healer's palm held the line of my spine like a warm seam, and Chaska's shadow lay across my feet, a shade tree made of a man. The camp exhaled in one careful breath. I tasted the grit of parting on my tongue and decided to let it stay there, a reminder that sweetness is not the only proof of life. Someone added wood to the fire, and the flames answered in a language I had learned to understand. Steady, unhurried, certain. I felt my sons shift, the tiny flecks of heel against my side, the thin cough turning into a swallow and then into quiet. Across the ring, the boy with the canteen pretended to look away and failed, his curiosity bright as a coin in the dust. The healer lifted her hand from my back and looked not at my face but at the babies, as if there were no question left to ask that wasn't already answered by the rise and fall of their chests. Chaska spoke only after the hush had grown strong enough to hold words without breaking. He said we would name the boys before the stars climbed much higher. His voice carried no ceremony at first, only the simple instruction of a man saying water must be drawn before dark. But the people began to gather, and their gathering turned his words into a ritual. They brought tokens, feathers pale as bone, beads the color of ravens, stones that held the day's heat, scraps of cloth that had traveled farther than I had once believed possible. Meaning, not wealth. Memory, not display. I waited until the others had laid their offerings, then slid a strip of fabric from the fold of my blanket. It was the torn hem of the dress I had nearly died in, a salt-hard, sun-faded piece of the woman who had bled and cursed and refused to vanish. I placed it in the center and did not apologize for the stains. Chaska set a thin cedar carving upon the fabric, the figure smooth where countless thumbs had smoothed it. Our two histories touched there, not battling but braiding, the old fibers accepting the new wood like a wound accepting a stitch. The chant began low, almost under the breath, and then rose as more voices found it. I had no words for the syllables, yet I knew where to put my breath. The sound curled through the circle and climbed the night. Smoke carried it farther. My sons' faces turned toward the warmth as if they too recognized what the throat cannot name. And then the chant thinned, and the silence that replaced it was not empty but expectant. I stepped forward and the desert leaned closer. "Silas," I said, letting the name travel the length of my ribs. It left me like a bird released and did not return. "Jonah," I said, the second name following the first until the two were inseparable. Cords in a single rope. The syllables went out across the dark as if the dunes themselves were ears. I had spoken many words into this land. Some had been swallowed, some had been thrown back sharp. These did something else. They settled. They took. The desert which had refused to be witness to my suffering bore witness now to my vow. When the murmurs of blessing drifted around us, I turned to Chaska and found myself empty of anything that could stand where gratitude should have stood. I reached for the rough edges of humor and found none. I reached for thanks in the language of my mother and found it too narrow. "I have nothing equal to this," I said at last, because anything else would have been a lie people tell when they cannot bear to be seen. Chaska did not rescue me from the truth or adorn it. "You give us future," he said, and inclined his head toward the boys. The healer touched the soft place at Jonah's temple and murmured a blessing that sounded like water laid on a wound. Hands moved in and out of the ring with offerings and quiet words, and for once I did not shrink from the circle's gaze. To be looked at as belonging is a gentler weight than any roof. The fire's light lifted faces and smoothed them. I thought of Daniel's hand hanging useless in the air and of the leader's jaw set tight for the horizon, and I let those images pass through me the way smoke passes through clothing, leaving a mark, yes, but one I would wear without apology. Survival had once meant breath and nothing else, a thin arithmetic of hours. I had measured my life by whether my heart kept time. Now as Silas's fingers loosened in sleep and Jonah's mouth worked a dream, a new measurement announced itself. To live is to stand without begging. To live is to be named in a circle that expects your voice to carry, not disappear. Survival without dignity is a drought you drink forever and never quench. I bent close to the crowns of their heads, hair smelling of smoke and milk and something that did not belong to the desert at all. Promise. You will walk in both worlds, I whispered. You will not be asked to choose between blood and wisdom. You will be taught the strength you came from and the grace that found us when strength was not enough. You will honor the language that kept my lungs working and the names that tie you to those who carried me before I knew how to carry myself. The vow entered me as much as it left me, engraving itself along the bone. Night deepened and softened, the sky bleaching from bruised violet to the blue-black that makes stars look like they are breathing. Laughter moved around the fire in low tides. Someone passed a gourd. Someone else told a story whose shape I understood even when its words outran me. The boy with the canteen sidled nearer until his knee nearly touched my blanket, then remembered himself and scooted back, his dignity and his curiosity wrestling to a draw. The healer's broth made a ribbon of steam that drew a line between worlds and asked nothing of either except patience. I let my eyes rest. The sounds of safety are subtle and many. Spoons against wood, fabric whispering against skin, a cough answered by the simple act of turning toward it. I listened until listening became rest. I thought, not for the first time, of the roof Daniel had promised, the bed, the doctor, the speed. I saw them as clearly as if they had been sketched on the dark. 4 walls against the wind, a mattress that remembered your shape, a man with clean hands who would cut and stitch without judgment. But in the next breath I saw the arithmetic that had already been done in that world, the table where loss was calculated and weighed against wheels, where a woman's breath was measured beside the distance to a fort, where twins were a number that did not travel. The desert had forced me to learn its math, yes, but here the people had rewritten the problem. They had refused to measure me as drag. They had counted my sons as more than the cost of carrying them. I pressed my mouth to Silas's hair, then to Jonah's, and tasted smoke and salt and a sweetness I refused to name for fear of it fleeing. You will not be abandoned again, I said at a volume that might have been prayer, might have been law. The circle kept its shape. The stars cut their path over our heads. In the curve of my arms, 2 lives answered me with sleep. I had once believed endings were loud, gunshot, shout, the slam of a door. Tonight I learned that beginnings can be quieter than ash settling. They can be the lift of a chant that pauses so a mother can speak. When the fire fell into coals, Chaska crouched and used a stick to draw a line in the dust. Not a wall, not a border. A path. He looked up long enough for me to understand the question. Would I teach the boys to read both the line and the land it crossed? I nodded. He erased the line with his palm and left the ground as it had been, unbroken except by the prints of those who knew how to walk it. The healer returned with a bundle of herbs and placed them by my knee with a nod that was neither instruction nor permission but kinship. Wind came from the west, carrying the last ghost of the caravan. I let it pass over my face and did not turn to follow it. A different wind arrived later, small and busy, the kind that makes fire think. Sparks lifted and vanished into a sky so wide no word I had brought from my old life could measure it. I breathed and counted, not fear, not distance, not hours. I counted the ways a body can be held by a place, by water, by hands, by a name spoken aloud and answered by the dark. I counted until numbers became something else, and then I let counting go. Tomorrow I would begin to stitch the 2 stories together in ways that would not tear. I would ask the healer for words I could borrow and carry them alongside those my mother had given me. I would learn how to bind my sons' feet in the morning so the sand burned less, and teach them when the time came to tie a roof line that did not fight the wind. I would listen when the elders spoke and correct the ones who said my boys were only one thing. I would teach them to bow their heads for both blessings and to lift their chins for both histories. I would show them that strength is not a wall but a door you open for the ones who come behind you. For now, I watched the last flame settle into an ember and loved the quiet for what it was. Not emptiness but fullness put gently to bed. I did not pray. Not because I had forgotten how, but because the prayer was already spoken in the way the circle held, in the way my son's breaths matched the soft wind, in the way my own name had started to sound less like a question and more like a house. My body learned in that hour how to relax without apology. The desert learned perhaps that I would not be moved by anything less than truth. The horizon waited, because the horizon always does. It holds both threat and promise without favor. I understood that homes must be claimed again and again, not just once at a fire under kindly stars. I knew that the world beyond the dunes might arrive wearing many faces, trade and treaty, rumor and hunger, a returning regret or a brand new cruelty. I did not fear the fact of that. I only feared forgetting what had been named here. So I said their names again into the warm dark and let the syllables settle like seeds in a field that was not empty at all. When humanity breaks boundaries, even the desert can become home.